Welcome to Practicing Life Podcast. I'm your host, Ashley Pitzer. Today's episode is going to be on isolation in romantic relationships. This is really important to me because just in this last week, I ran across 3 different women who all were in romantic relationships, whether they were married or committed, that were in isolation. 2 of them actually admitted it. Another person was completely unaware. And on top of that, I listened to 2 parents talk about their children no longer wanting to have a relationship with them that suspect it's because of their partner. So isolation is huge. It is huge. And it is often the first flag to know that you are in an emotionally abusive relationship. The problem is it is so subtle. So this podcast is really important to me because I see it happening everywhere, and it also happened to me. So I will use my own life examples to illustrate something, to illustrate what you need to understand about this. So what I would like to say is that this type of relationship is toxic and it's unhealthy, even if you are choosing it. And if you are choosing it, that's your personal choice. I'm not here to tell you to choose otherwise. I'm just wanting to, one, inform you that emotional abuse is an unhealthy relationship. So if you are in isolation, then you are most likely in an unhealthy, toxic relationship. And you can choose to continue to be in this relationship. That is up to you. I'm not here to tell you who to be with or, how it should look, but I want you to understand what you're actually choosing. Because at the time when I was doing this, I wasn't really aware of the long-term consequences and I wasn't aware of what it was costing me. And that's going to be what this podcast is really about. So from my perspective, I was choosing on a case-by-case situation, on a day-by-day basis, I was choosing to maintain peace between my husband and I. So, for example, I knew it upset my husband if I came home from work and I was on the phone. So, while I had my 30-minute drive from work, I would be talking to my mom or a girlfriend. And as soon as I pulled into the driveway, I would say, "Oh, I got to go." Sometimes I would even let my friend or, whoever know, like, "Oh, my husband doesn't like it," when I'm on the phone. Now, I did this because when I walked in the door and I was on the phone, it would upset my husband. Sometimes he would say something, sometimes he wouldn't, but it wouldn't matter. As somebody who's empathetic, I could sense his anger and his frustration. And even if I was blind to that, even if I didn't have the ability to sense it, I could still read his body language. And I also could see his behaviors. Sometimes maybe slamming doors or maybe stomping as he went upstairs or the like as soon as you come in the door or as soon as you get off the phone with that person, the complaints of I can't stand that person's voice, or why are you talking to this person, or this person doesn't, treat you right. Like whatever it may be, there was always like an attack. And so I was in the practice of avoiding having this conflict. This is very common. This is very, very common to have people pleasing behaviors and 2, avoidant behaviors. I avoided conflict. I was a people pleaser. And so it's very natural for someone who is also empathetic to attract somebody who has a controlling type of personality. Now, exerting control is often done by somebody who has narcissism or has narcissistic traits or tendencies. I just want to point out, as this is a fab word right now, narcissism is a personality disorder. But you can have narcissism traits or tendencies without having a diagnosis of a personality disorder. What really matters is the severity of your behaviors and your actions, how long you have had them, and the extent to them. Like, is it crossing over multiple areas of your life? Is it in your work? Is it in your friendship? Is it in your personal life? Is it showing up everywhere? So there are 9 traits that they look for in order to get your NPD diagnosis, which is your narcissism personality disorder. And amongst that, though, there's still a spectrum. So when I'm talking about these type of relationships, know that there can be a person, like for instance, the way I look at narcissism is it's an extreme self-importance with lack of accountability, responsibility for themselves, but also the lack of ability to understand or care what another person is going through. So you can have a spectrum of this. They might be able to show temporary care or care if it gets them what they need. People who exert control often use emotions like a weapon. But for those of you who may be unfamiliar to this or new to my podcast, let me just back up and say that I have 90 plus recordings. I have definitely talked about my relationship with my husband. At one point, I realized that I was in a toxic relationship, despite years of people telling me that I was in a controlling relationship. It really wasn't until things started to fall apart for me that I really took ownership of it. And instead of avoiding conflicts, I stood up and I faced it and I asked for divorce with my husband, and we separated for months. And in this situation, my husband did want to work on the relationship and work on himself. And so one of my terms, my boundaries, was if I would consider getting a relationship with him, he had to go to, I'll call it like narcissism school. Like he had to go and get training to help him understand his behaviors, why he was doing it. Now I do kind of the opposite thing, not necessarily for narcissistic people, but for empaths. And I really help people understand like who they are and why they are this. And I help them discover really what their true potential is and who they were like always meant to be, but never allowed to become. So like, what did they come to this, planet Earth to do? Like, who are they really without all of the social conditionings and the peer pressure and stuff like that? So what my husband went through, understanding who he was and why he was doing it, is kind of what I do for the empath side. And so my husband has made significant changes. We have gone through a lot of life coaching and different things to be where we are today. And this is one of the reasons I talk so much about this, because when I was going, like when my husband entered his school and when I was going through my coaching, one of the statements I would hear is less than 5% of narcissists change. It's not in there. It's not for their benefit to change. They get so much by exerting control and using their emotions as a weapon. So they don't often change. And so one of the things they tell you is don't expect to change. But if you leave that relationship, you are most likely going to enter into a similar relationship with somebody else that may present themselves differently, may have different behaviors, but ultimately you end up getting into the same type of toxic, unhealthy relationship. And this is one of the reasons I talk so much about it. So if you're unfamiliar with kind of a narcissistic behaviors, let me list some things off that you may see. They take credit for your work at work. They blame you for their mistakes. They belittle you or treat you cruelly. They can flower you with like love bombing, like, so they can just flower with you with so much love and attention to say sorry, to be like, oh, I messed up, so let me give you everything that you wanted so that you stay or you forgive me. In my own personal relationship, every time I got really close to leaving my husband, he would finally break down and give me what I've been wanting for like ever. And again, this goes back to how the relationship was structured. We weren't equals. If you're in a relationship with a narcissist, you're not an equal. And I often had to ask permission. That's another red flag. I don't ask for permission from my husband today. If I want to go hang out with my friends, I tell him what I'm doing and when I'm doing. I don't ask. I don't wait to see if he's going to be angry or upset or lash out or to tell me what he thinks about it. That's none of his business. What is his business, because we have kids and it's common courtesy, is to know what I'm doing and when. So when you're in this type of relationship, and if you were like me asking permission, you're already in a situation where you're being controlled because they have the right to either say you can hang out with somebody or can't hang out with somebody. But it gets so nitty-gritty. It gets really hard to sometimes see this, because even though that could be like, oh, well, that's really clear. That's black and white. That's a red flag. Isolation is very, very subtle. It can come from, like I said, when I came in the door and my husband would be unhappy to hear somebody's voice, like it could just be complaints. And you can be intentionally choosing it. It's not like my husband would say, you are not allowed to be on the phone, right? It was the fact that I was a people pleaser and I could see and feel his energy and I didn't like it and I wanted to avoid it. So I would be intentionally choosing this behavior to avoid having a conflict with him. I was avoiding fights. I was avoiding feeling his anger, right? So I was intentionally choosing it, but it was costing me something in the long run. It was costing me friendship. It was costing me fun. It was costing me all these things, but it gets very hard to discern because, like, for instance, one of the things that my husband wanted at a certain point in our relationship was for me to be home with the kids. It just makes sense. It's supporting the kids. And, he wanted to be a supporter. He wanted to be able to provide for me. Like, it met his ego, it filled his ego boat, right? But it also kept me isolated. It kept me away from coworkers. It kept me away from having friendships. It kept me from having my own money. And it kept me asking for permission and getting into financial fights with him, because I'd be like, oh, I want this. And he'd be like, well, we don't have the money for it. And I'd be like, well, I'll just go get a job. And then he'd be like, well, then that makes me feel like I'm not working hard enough, or I'm not doing more to provide for you, and he would make it about him. And why I say this can be really tricky is because narcissistic tendency behaviors, they can make it seem like they're supporting you. Like, for instance, I stay at home and I write. So, my husband could say, well, I just want to support you in the dreams that you've always wanted. Well, that could be very true. But the same thing is true, is that this keeps me potentially not earning the same amount of income, not having the same amount of freedoms. So these are all things you have to kind of step back and look at and make discernments about. And you can choose this. Like, I chose to stay home and work, right? I have my own business. I have my own money. I do these things. These are things that I'm choosing. But at the entire time, I have to also sit back and evaluate, is my husband slipping back into old behavior? Am I slipping back into old behavior? Because these patterns, once they exist in your brain, they're like a highway. And all you're doing when you create a new pattern is going down a different highway. But you can easily get into auto mode and slip back into a different highway. So let's pretend, like where I live, you have two highways to get home, right? They're both getting you to the same point, but how you get there is differently. And this is a lot of times how your brain works. Like, your brain just automatically selects which highway you're going to go down, sometimes without even like really putting thought into it, because you're an autopilot. So setting back and evaluating these things are things that I still do today to make sure that I'm in check and to make sure that what I'm having is really what I want, not only now in the short term, but in the long term. So I want to just bring up the point that if you are in isolation, and whatever it may be, because you chose it, because you chose to be a stay-at-home mom, because you chose to follow your dream. Like I have artists that stay home. I am an artist. Like I write books. That's artistry. You could choose staying at home and you can think it's your choice, but know that there's a lot of manipulation that goes into this. And that's what emotional abuse is often. It's so covert and it's so subtle. It really takes setting back and reflecting on things. And in my relationship, one of the rules that we have is I really don't ask for his advice. And this is one of the ways that I can distinguish whether or not he's manipulating or exerting any type of control. So I don't ask his opinion on something, and he knows not to give it. And that's one of the ways that it makes it really black and white for me to know, am I doing this for me? Is this supporting me? Now, back before we went through all of this transformation and these adjustments, this didn't exist. And so my husband would always tell me what he thought. It wasn't just what he thought, he kind of had the expectation that I would do what he thought. So you could be choosing to stay at home because this is what you've always dreamed about, but take in consideration if you wanted to change your mind and go back to work, would that cause a conflict? Would you be avoiding a conflict to stay at home? Now, all of this stuff gets really complicated because we have so many things that weigh into our decisions. But on the topic of isolation, if you're not going out with your friends, if you're not talking to your parents, what are some of the reasons that you are doing that? What are some of the input and the advice that you're getting from your significant other? Are they only allowing you to do it when they're around? Do they have to be with you? Like if, for instance, I am from Indiana, and one of the things that happened when I got married, prior to getting married, I could do the 4-hour drive from Missouri to Indiana all I wanted, whenever I wanted. And all of a sudden, when I got married, my husband didn't feel like it was safe anymore. And he was my husband, and his job was to protect me. And so if I wanted to go home, he had to go with me. And he may not want to go home, and he may not want to spend time with my family. That doesn't happen now. I go with or without him. I go with my mom. I go by myself. It's not his decision. It's none of his business, other than A, making sure her child care is taken care of and arrangements are made, and B, letting him know what I'm doing. Right. And so this is some of the stuff that you see. One of the things that I was listening to someone talk about is they didn't know that they were being controlled by their husband, because every time they wanted to go home and visit their family, their husband would always be like, oh, wait a minute. When are you going to do that? Oh, well, I had a surprise for you. I was taking you away on a weekend. And this happened over and over and over again for years. And this person was always super, super excited. They're like, oh, look how much my husband loves me. Look at all these surprises. Look at all these great trips that we get to go on. We have so much fun together. But they weren't really seeing the bigger picture. They weren't connecting all the dots. And they couldn't see that they were actually in a relationship that was toxic. And their spouse in this case was separating them for their family, or only allowing them to go see their family on certain terms. And those terms always had to deal with their involvement in it. So isolation is one of the first red flags for emotional abuse. And I want you to just acknowledge the fact, if you will, that isolation is used in prison as well as a form of like torture in war. Isolation has some major side effects. It is isolation ultimately leads to depression. It is linked with health issues like heart disease, anxiety, memory loss, cognitive decline. That's the long-term consequences. And then you also have the loss of connection to other people, to your friends, to your family, a loss of opportunities to go out, the loss of growing yourself and evolving yourself. And this is all in the name of love, right? Or is it love? You know, one of the things that you have to ask yourself is it love to always be with your partner, because in the very beginning, it makes sense. Honestly, our first relationships happen when we're so young. Some of us like 12, 13, maybe some of us older, but it happens in this age where our brain is still very conditioned, and it sets a standard for us. And so in that infatuation stage from your teenage years or your early adolescence, it was very common for you to spend all your time with each other. And it was a very fun stage. But when you get into adulthood, the game changes quite a bit. You may have other responsibilities, things that you may not want to do. And so spending time with somebody that makes you feel great is definitely a wonderful alternative. But when you're an adult, you have to adult. You have to go grocery shopping or get food or eat or do laundry or pay bills or show up at your job. And a narcissist, someone with narcissism, wants all the attention. They're attention seekers. And it fills their ego to have your focus on them. So that's one of the reasons that they will put you in isolation. But another reason is so that you don't have any outside influences. So you don't have anything to kind of counter back with. So isolation puts them in more control. They might separate you from your parents, and they may say, well, your parents don't like me. They've never approved of me. And these things can be completely valid. And maybe there's a reason that they don't like you too. But because it's so subtle and covert, it really takes setting back and acknowledging what is really going on and looking for all the little clues and all the little signs. So if it's a problem, 99% or 95% of the time for you to go out with your friends, if it's a problem for you to have time alone, because even that is a problem. And a lot of these unhealthy, emotional, abusive relationships, they can't even have, 20 minutes to themselves. It's almost like you have to love them more than you love yourself. Otherwise, you're not truly loving them. And what gets really tricky about this is often it's empathetic people, people-pleasing people, perfectionists, these type of people that get into this type of relationship where control is exerted over them. It's like, to me, in hindsight, it's like oil and water. Like you can see that they don't blend together, and yet they are together. So these are just some of the things that I want you to think about. And there's a lot of stuff that we could go into, but I just want you to look at your relationships. And if you are feeling isolated or you're considering whether or not you're isolated, examine why that is. Like, what are the main points that causes you not to spend time with your friends or your family or to stay after work for that work party? Is it because you're avoiding a fight? Is it because your partner doesn't like you to go anywhere without you? I mean, there were times that there's so many times that I didn't go and do something because I wanted to make my husband happy, and that meant staying at home with him. But when that happens all the time, I would just point out to you that it is not your job to fill his emotional tank. And not only that, but it's most likely unsatiable, meaning you can give and give and give and give, and it's still not enough. Now, in my case, I ended up with an autoimmune disorder. I ended up with adrenal fatigue. I ended up with kids that were having severe issues in school and at home because control and limiting your abilities to think and feel and do all of these things have a consequence. Shoving down your emotions and pretending they don't exist so you can make somebody else happy has a consequence. Now, I don't want to put anybody in danger. because, one of the things that can happen is for when you challenge your significant other to go out, they may blow up. And it's one thing to blow up and say angry words, which emotional abuse is often belittling angry words. It's quite another thing to experience like physical violence. And this can happen if you do challenge it. So really what I really would ask for people to do if they are feeling isolated is just to become aware. Become aware. And then if you want to do something differently, then there are other professionals that you can seek. I went and seen different professionals to help me get out of the relationship. But one of the things that I do help people do that really wasn't available for me when I was going through this was I really help people build their own self-love, because there's really two ways that I have found to get out of a toxic relationship. And even when I was going through, I hired a toxic relationship coach, and their method was for me to focus on how painful everything was. And their method was to focus on everything negative this person did. And guess what that did for me? That put me into extremely low vibrations. It put me in fear all the time. It put me in a state of being just scared out of my mind. The alternative to that, which nobody was there really for me to help me do this, but even my toxic relationship coach told me the only other people that have ever exited a relationship is because they built so much self-love that they just couldn't tolerate to be in that relationship anymore. Now, I left my relationship while working with a toxic relationship coach who focused on pain, 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 fear, 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 scared, 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 the worst case scenario all the time. And so I was like feeling like I was fleeting for my life by the time I left this relationship, when I can now tell you in hindsight, because my husband and I got back together and we have spent the, I don't know, 2 or 3 years coexisting together and rebuilding our relationship, that it really took me becoming a life coach and focusing on self-love to get me to where I am today. And that's what I like to help other people do. All right. You matter. I'll see you next time.